You never know how loud your own heart is until the world stops making noise and the only thing left is the drum in your chest. Most people think silence is peaceful, a lack of chaos, but out here in Redwood Valley, silence is a predator that waits for you to scream. When the birds stop singing and the wind dies in the treetops, it doesn't mean the forest is sleeping. It means something has entered the room and locked the door. If you are hearing this, do not go looking for the campsite at the northern ridge, because what we found, there wasn't human anymore. The ranger station received the distress signal at 3 a.m., a burst of static that sounded like wet tearing, and a voice begging for the sun to rise. I was the one on duty that night, the one who listened to the frequency dissolve into a low, rhythmic thrumming that made my teeth ache. We knew the group of 4 campers had hiked out past the warning markers, looking for that authentic, untouched wilderness experience that usually gets tourists killed. They wanted isolation, they wanted to disconnect from the grid, but they didn't understand that the grid is the only thing keeping the dark away. Elias drove the lead Jeep, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, as the gravel road narrowed into a suffocating tunnel of ancient bark and pine needles. Beside him, Sarah tried to keep the mood light, cracking jokes about bears and Bigfoot, but her laughter sounded brittle against the looming trees. In the back, Marcus and Chloe were already arguing about the map, their voices too loud, too distinct in the encroaching gloom of the deep valley. They didn't notice that with every mile they drove, the ambient sounds of the afternoon were being stripped away, layer by layer. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun was dipping below the ridge, painting the sky in bruises of purple and charcoal gray. The redwoods here were titanic, ancient sentinels that blocked out the sky, their roots twisting out of the earth like petrified snakes. Elias killed the engine, and for a moment the ticking of the cooling metal was the only sound in the universe. It felt heavy, a physical pressure pushing against their eardrums, as if the air itself had become denser, harder to breathe. They set up their tents in a tight circle, an instinctive attempt to create a perimeter against the unknown vastness surrounding them. Marcus started a fire, the crackle of dry wood providing a comforting, familiar rhythm that pushed back the crushing quiet. They opened beers and grilled meat, the smell of cooking fat, briefly masking the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not by eyes, but by the trees themselves. "It's too quiet," she whispered, staring into the black gaps between the trunks where the firelight failed to reach. Elias scoffed, poking the embers with a stick, sparks flying up to die in the dark canopy above. He told her that's what they came for, the absence of city noise, the pure tranquility of nature. But deep down even he felt the hairs on the back of his neck standing up, reacting to a static charge in the air. Around midnight, the forest didn't just go quiet. It went dead, as if someone had flipped a switch and cut the power to the ecosystem. The crickets ceased their chirping mid-note, the rustle of nocturnal animals vanished, and the wind simply stopped moving. The campers froze, beer cans halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting around the perimeter of the light. It was a vacuum of sound so absolute that the ringing in their ears became a deafening siren. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding oddly flat, lacking the usual resonance it carried in the open air. Nobody had heard anything, and that was the problem. The absence was more terrifying than a roar. Chloe huddled closer to the fire, pulling her jacket tight, her eyes wide and shimmering with the reflection of the dying flames. She whispered that she wanted to go home, her voice trembling, barely audible over the pounding of her own blood. Elias stood up, grabbing a heavy flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp, dusty cone through the darkness. He swept the light across the tree line, illuminating nothing but rough bark and hanging moss that looked like old rags. "Hello?" he called out, but the word didn't echo. It was swallowed instantly, absorbed by the forest floor. It was as if the valley was insulated, padded to ensure that no scream could travel further than a few yards. Marcus laughed nervously, standing up to relieve himself, making a joke about scaredy cats as he walked toward the edge of the light. "I'll be right back," he said, stepping past the boundary where the fire's glow surrendered to the shadows. They watched his silhouette merge with the blackness, the crunch of his boots on dry leaves fading rapidly. They waited for the sound of his zipper, the stream hitting the ground, a whistle, anything. 5 minutes passed, and the silence remained unbroken, thick and suffocating like wool packed into their ears. "Marcus?" Sarah called out, her voice cracking, the pitch too high, betraying her rising panic. There was no answer, just the oppressive weight of the trees leaning in closer, the branches interlocking like fingers. Elias grabbed a hatchet from near the woodpile, his jaw set tight, signaling for the girls to stay by the fire. He walked toward where Marcus had vanished, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly in his grip. The ground was soft here, covered in layers of pine needles that muffled his footsteps, making him feel like a ghost. He found footprints leading behind a massive redwood, the tread clearly visible in the damp soil, but the tracks didn't turn around. They just stopped abruptly, as if Marcus had been lifted straight into the air. "Marcus, quit screwing around," Elias hissed, spinning in a circle, the light dancing frantically over the underbrush. Then he heard a sound that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. It was a voice coming from high above in the canopy, soft and wet and wrong. It was Marcus's voice, but it was repeating the last thing he said. "I'll be right back. Right back, back, back." The repetition wasn't an echo. It was mechanical, like a recording skipping on a damaged tape loop. Elias aimed the light upward, the beam struggling to penetrate the dense weave of branches 100 feet up. He saw something pale shift behind a thick limb, a limb that looked too smooth to be wood. It moved with a fluid, boneless grace, sliding around the trunk of the tree, hiding from the light. He sprinted back to the campsite, crashing through the bushes, no longer caring about the noise he made. Sarah and Chloe were standing back to back, holding knives, their faces masks of sheer terror. "We leave." "Now," Elias commanded, kicking dirt over the fire, plunging them into near total darkness. The sudden extinguishing of the light made the forest feel like it had jumped forward, closing the distance between them. They scrambled for the jeep, fumbling with the door handles, their breathing ragged and loud in the quiet. Elias jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, the engine cranking with a desperate whine. It sputtered and died, the sound of the failure magnifying the silence that rushed back in immediately. He tried again, pumping the gas, sweat dripping from his forehead into his eyes, stinging like acid. From the darkness the voice came again, closer this time, emanating from directly behind the vehicle. "I'll be right back," it mimicked, but the tone had changed. It was now a guttural growl, stripped of humanity. Chloe screamed, a piercing shriek that should have woken the dead, but the forest dampened it instantly. Something slammed into the roof of the Jeep, denting the metal, the impact rocking the heavy vehicle on its suspension. "Lock the doors," Sarah yelled, throwing herself into the back seat, pulling Chloe down to the floorboards. Elias stared out the windshield, the headlights cutting twin paths through the swirling mist that had begun to rise. In the beams he saw them tall, elongated figures, pale as moonlight, standing perfectly still between the trees. They had no faces, just smooth expanses of flesh where eyes and mouths should be, yet they were watching. The creature on the roof began to scratch, long rhythmic strokes that sounded like nails on a chalkboard. It was testing the metal, searching for a weakness, a way to peel the shell open and get to the meat inside. Elias slammed his hand on the horn, a long blaring note intended to scare them off. The creatures in the light didn't flinch. Instead, they opened vertical slits in their chests and mimicked the horn perfectly. The sound coming from the monsters was louder, distorted, amplified into a sonic weapon that vibrated the Jeep's windows. Chloe covered her ears, sobbing, her body curled into a tight ball on the dirty floor mat. The creature on the roof stopped scratching, and the mimicry cut off abruptly, plunging them back into silence. The sudden drop in noise was disorienting, leaving them dizzy and nauseous. Then the glass of the rear window shattered, imploding inward in a shower of safety diamonds. A hand, elongated and possessing too many joints, reached in, blindly groping for purchase. Sarah lashed out with her knife, slicing across the pale, rubbery skin of the intruder. The creature didn't scream. It merely retracted the limb with lightning speed, making a soft, wet clicking sound. "We have to run," Elias whispered, realizing the Jeep was becoming a coffin. "The keys," he stammered. "I dropped them outside when I tried to check the engine earlier. It was a lie to protect them from the hopelessness of a dead battery, but he needed them to move. On my count, we bolt for the trail, head back to the main road." He didn't wait for them to agree. He threw his door open and rolled out, hitting the ground and sprinting. The diversion worked. The pale shapes turned their faceless heads toward the noise of his flight. Sarah grabbed Chloe, dragging her out the opposite side, pushing her toward the narrow path they had hiked in on. Behind them, the sounds of struggle erupted, Elias shouting, the thud of heavy blows, and the wet tearing of fabric. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs felt like lead pipes. The forest path was treacherous in the dark, roots waiting to snag ankles, low branches whipping at faces. Every time they slowed down, they heard Elias's voice, drifting through the trees. "Run, ... Sarah, ... run." "Chloe," it called, but the cadence was wrong, broken and skipping. Sarah stopped, gripping a tree for support, her chest heaving, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Stop," she hissed to Chloe. "Listen." The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, throwing itself like a ventriloquist's trick. It was trying to herd them, to lure them off the path, and into the deep, unexplored hollows. They abandoned the trail, diving into the thick underbrush, crawling on hands and knees through the ferns. The moss soaked their jeans, the cold seeping into their bones, numbing their extremities. They lay flat, pressing their bodies into the earth, trying to become invisible, trying to become silent. Above them the canopy rustled, though there was no wind, suggesting something large was moving through the branches. A beam of light swept over their heads, missing them by inches, illuminating the spores floating in the air. It was Elias's flashlight, held by a hand that was definitely not human. The creature holding it was perched on a low branch, its body contorted in an impossible shape. It swept the light back and forth, methodically scanning the forest floor like a searchlight. Chloe clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a whimper, tears streaming down her muddy face. The creature dropped from the tree, landing silently on the soft needle bed, not 10 feet away. It stood up, unfolding to a height of nearly 8 feet, its pale skin glowing faintly in the gloom. It tilted its head, the smooth surface where a face should be turning toward their hiding spot. It opened the slit in its chest and let out the sound of Chloe crying, recorded perfectly from minutes ago. It was taunting her, using her own fear as a lure to draw her out. Sarah squeezed Chloe's hand so hard she felt bones shift, a silent command to stay frozen. The creature waited, twitching slightly, its long fingers flexing and unflexing. When no answer came, it moved on, its gait loping and unnatural, disappearing into the mist. They waited for what felt like hours, shivering violently, until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the trees. The sunrise didn't bring warmth, but it brought visibility, stripping the monsters of their shadow cloaks. They crawled back to the main road, battered, bruised, and hollowed out by terror. They walked for 6 miles before a ranger truck found them, 2 wandering ghosts on the asphalt. They didn't speak, couldn't speak, their voices stolen by the valley. When we questioned them, Sarah only wrote one thing on the notepad we gave her. They don't eat flesh. They eat sound, and we were too loud. We organized a search party for Elias and Marcus, fully armed, moving in a tactical grid during high noon. We found the campsite destroyed, the tents shredded, the jeep overturned like a toy. There were no bodies, no blood, just a pristine, terrifying absence of life. But we found the tape recorder Elias used for his audio logs, lying in the center of the clearing. I played it back in the evidence locker, expecting to hear his notes on the flora and fauna. Instead, the tape contained 4 hours of silence, followed by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. Then, in a voice that sounded like Elias but distorted, stretched thin, "Don't come looking. We are part of the quiet now." I burned the tape, but I can still hear it when I try to sleep, that static hiss of the Redwood Valley. The forest is closed now, fenced off with high razor wire and signs warning of structural instability. But the locals know the truth. They know the valley is hungry, and it's waiting for the next noise. Sometimes, standing at the perimeter, you can hear familiar voices calling your name from the deep woods. Don't listen to them, don't answer back, and for God's sake, don't step off the road. The silence is infectious, and once it gets inside your head, it never leaves. I'm resigning tomorrow, moving to the city, somewhere with sirens and traffic and life, because out here, in the shadow of the giants, the quiet is loud enough to kill you. The horror isn't just that they died. It's that they are still there, repurposed as lures. Every time a bird chirps in that valley, it's quickly silenced, snatched from the air. The ecosystem has changed, evolved into a trap designed to harvest vibration. And I swear, last night I heard Marcus scratching at my window, asking to be let in. The glass didn't break, but the scratching didn't stop until the sun came up. I live 10 miles from the valley, which means they are expanding their range. They are learning that the lights of the town mean more food, more sounds to consume. So tonight, I'm keeping the radio on loud, drowning out the scratching. If you are listening to this broadcast, turn up your volume. Make noise, scream, sing, break something. Do not let the silence settle in your home, because once it goes quiet, you'll start to hear the mimicry, and once you hear your own voice calling from the dark, it's already too late. The campers of Redwood Valley didn't just disappear. They were translated into a frequency that hurts to listen to. The scary part is wondering if they are still conscious inside that noise, trapped in a loop of their final terrified moments, playing on repeat forever. So when you go camping, bring a gun, but bring a boombox too. Silence is not golden. Silence is the dinner bell. Sarah still hasn't spoken a word since that day. She sits in the institution, staring at the wall, covering her ears. The doctors say it's trauma, but I know the truth. She's trying not to let the static leak out of her head, because she knows that if she speaks, it might not be her voice that comes out. It might be the sound of the trees shifting, the sound of the pale walker clicking its tongue, the sound of the Redwood Valley claiming one last victim. So I'm leaving this warning as my final act as a ranger. Avoid the northern ridge. If the forest goes silent, run toward the loudest thing you can find. And never ever trust a voice that comes from the shadows. The campers are gone, but the valley is full of stolen laughs, stolen screams, and stolen goodbyes. The night the forest went silent was just the beginning. Now the silence is spreading, and it's coming for us all. I can hear the scratching again, louder this time. It sounds like it's coming from inside the closet. "I'll be right back," the voice says. It sounds exactly like me.